Okay, today's technique is called wet on wet. I think you are going to love this. It's so much fun. So, the way we do it is we wet our watercolor paper first. You will see that this is very important that you do this on watercolor paper. So, I am just taking plain water here and I'm really wetting my area. Really, really, really. Right now I'm going to show you a couple of different types of watercolor. So right here is just your regular praying watercolor. So I've added water to my paper. Now I'm getting a really wet watercolor and dropping it in there. I'm not brushing back and forth, I'm just dropping. I might go for another color now. I'm going to get a lot of water into this green. What you'll see is that the color, I'm going with a darker green, the color just kind of explodes. It all starts bleeding together and it has a really cool effect. Now, this is with just the simple praying watercolors. I'm going to show you how you can also use the liquid watercolor. It's the exact same way, it's just sometimes the liquid watercolor is a little more concentrated. So it makes a little bit brighter of an impact. So that's the praying. I'm going to set this aside. I'm going to pull out some of my liquid watercolors that I've got in some jars. Clean my brush. Wet my area. This needs to be very wet, almost puddly wet, okay? Very, very wet. Wherever you stop painting the water is where the color will stop. If you'll see this one, do you see how it's not going outside of this square? Even though it all bled together and moved around, it's not going outside the square because I didn't put the water outside the square. Now, if I pick it up, it would run, but you get the idea. So now I've got some of this bright liquid watercolor. It's very concentrated. Do you see that? Woo! That like makes a huge like explosion of color. I mean, this is super, super, super cool, kiddos. I'm going to rinse my brush. I'm going to get a little bit of this yellowish, it's probably going to be green, honestly. Yeah. Dropping it in. Anytime that you think it's too dark, you can also just add more water on top. You can kind of dilute it a bit. Okay, so now the last thing, that's the basics of it. It's wet on wet, wet paper, wet watercolor. Sometimes though, you'll get a little bit too much and you'll need to lift it off. So I'm going to show you that technique. It's very easy, and sometimes you won't do it just because you have too much. Sometimes you will want to do this technique because it looks pretty cool. So I'm going to get some of this blue. I'm using the liquid again just to kind of show you. You can take just a regular paper towel, kind of bunch it up, and dab in certain areas. I wouldn't dab it everywhere because when you dab, it lifts the paint off, so you've got some really nice light spots. But by having the contrast of the light and the dark, it makes a really super cool effect. Now I'm going to go back. I'm going to actually dab everywhere just because I've got puddles happening. But you absolutely do not have to. I'm impatient and don't want to let it dry, so I'm just dabbing it. So there you have it. That is the wet on wet technique. Play around with that on some blank watercolor before we go back to our main project. Get some blank watercolor paper and just play with the wet on wet and see what colors you like best. Maybe you'll mix in some pinks and purples, or maybe you'll do like this, the blues. Maybe you'll do some reds and yellows, the warm colors. If you get too many colors, it could start turning to brown, and you want to find that out before you get to your main piece of work. So go ahead and start playing.